Welcome to What You Don't Know You Don't Know, the podcast that dives headfirst into the surprising, the overlooked, and the misunderstood. Hosted by a curious duo and one man, one woman, we explore the world's most fascinating ideas hiding in plain sight. From science and religion to politics, psychology, history, and everything in between, we shine a light on the knowledge that's publicly available but rarely discussed. Each episode is a deep but never dull conversation that challenges assumptions, sparks new perspectives, and reveals just how much more there is to know, especially about the things you didn't even know you were missing. Whether you're a skeptic, a seeker, or just someone who loves good conversation, this show will leave you thinking, questioning, and most importantly, knowing.
Ever wonder why we act morally? Or, what even makes something right? Is morality sort of out there, like gravity maybe, an objective force? Or is it more like, I don't know, liking chocolate ice cream, totally subjective? Today we're doing a deep dive into something called moral realism. It's this really fascinating idea that maybe some moral claims can be objectively true, like really true, independent of what any of us think or feel about them. Get ready for maybe some aha moments, because we're going to explore how these pretty abstract ideas might actually connect to your everyday decisions.
Yeah, we'll be trying to cut through some fairly complex philosophical arguments. We'll look at the different, let's say, flavors of moral realism. And then, perhaps most intriguingly, we'll connect it all to some really surprising empirical studies showing how just believing in objective moral facts can genuinely change how people behave in the real world.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning then. At its most basic level, what exactly is moral realism?
Right. So at its core, moral realism is the view that at least some moral claims have objective truth values. What that means is they're true in a way that's attitude independent. It's not just a matter of your personal opinion or what your culture happens to agree on.
So it's not just about what I feel is right or what my society says is right. It's claiming there's something deeper, more external.
Yeah, precisely. And that stands in pretty stark contrast to strong forms of anti-realism. Things like expressivism, for instance. Expressivism basically argues that when we use moral language, we're primarily expressing non-cognitive attitudes, like feelings or approval or disapproval, rather than actually describing objective facts about the world.
So an expressivist hears stealing is wrong and thinks, they're just saying, boo, stealing.
Sort of, yeah. That's the classic caricature, but it captures the essence. It's about expressing an attitude, not stating a fact. And some anti-realists, like Mark Timmons, they even call their view non-descriptivism.
Mm-hmm.
They hold that moral concepts, when you use them in moral context, they just don't function descriptively at all. They aren't describing anything.
Wow, okay. That really throws the difference into sharp relief. And just out of curiosity, does this term moral realism ever show up outside of pure philosophy?
It does, actually.
Mm-hmm.
There's a different, though maybe related, use in literary criticism. Lionel Trilling, for example, he used moral realism to describe writers like Henry James, Mark Twain, even Sigmund Freud. But he wasn't really talking about objective moral facts in the philosophical sense. He meant more their engaged imagination, their willingness to grapple with the full complexity and difficulty of human moral life, taking a really precise account of all the variousness, possibility, complexity, as he put it, not just depicting physical reality.
Interesting how a term can have those different shades of meaning. Okay, let's get back to the philosophy side. Because even within moral realism, you said there are different ways people think about these objective truths. What are the main schools?
Right. The two main camps, broadly speaking, are naturalistic moral realism and non-naturalistic moral realism. And what's really fascinating is how they differ on the fundamental nature of these moral properties. What kind of stuff are they? So first, you have naturalistic moral realism. This view basically holds that moral properties are natural properties. Think of them as being part of the natural world, discoverable through empirical methods, observation, scientific inquiry, similar in a way to scientific facts.
Okay, so things we can potentially study and understand through science.
That's the idea. Philosophers like Paul Bloomfield or Philippa Foot are often cited here. They sometimes suggest understanding moral goodness by analogy to physical health. Health is a property of a complex biological system functioning well. Similarly, they might say moral goodness is what helps humans flourish, achieve our sort of natural, maybe biologically influenced purposes. They often focus on what are called thick concepts like virtues, say courage, or vices like cruelty. These concepts have a lot of non-moral description packed into them, but they also carry clear moral weight.
So it's almost like you could observe moral health or dysfunction in individuals or societies, much like a doctor observes physical health.
That's a pretty good analogy, yeah.
Yeah.
And Peter Railton offers a really comprehensive naturalistic account. He tries to explicitly link normative ethics ideas about how we should act with empirical theories. He introduces this cool idea of objective interests. He uses this thought experiment. Imagine Lonnie Plus.
Lonnie Plus.
Yeah, Lonnie Plus is this like perfectly informed, perfectly rational version of Lonnie. Now, Lonnie might be dehydrated and really want a glass of milk, but Lonnie Plus, being fully informed, knows that what Lonnie really needs, what's in his objective interest, is clear fluids, not milk. Even if Lonnie himself doesn't realize it or desire it.
Huh. That's a powerful way to think about it. It's not just what you think you want, but what's actually good for you based on all the facts.
Exactly. It decouples good for you from your current desires or beliefs. And Railton extends this idea beyond just individuals. He talks about social rationality. He argues that moral norms often reflect a kind of rationality, but not just from one person's viewpoint. It's rationality from a sort of social perspective, concerned with efficiently pursuing what's good, non-morally good, for everyone in the group or society.
Okay, but how do those norms come about or change? Societies clearly change their minds about what's right.
All right, great question. Railton suggests there's a kind of feedback mechanism. If existing norms consistently sacrifice the interests of certain groups, that discontent builds up. Eventually, it can produce feedback at a social level, protests, movements, revolutions, whatever. This pressure can lead to the development of new norms that better approximate that ideal of social rationality, that better account for everyone's objective interests. Think about, historical examples like peasant rebellions against feudalism or the civil rights movement. Pressure from excluded groups forced a recognition of their interests, leading to new norms.
Okay, that makes sense for the naturalist side. What about the other camp, the non-naturalists?
Right, non-naturalistic moral realism. This view holds that moral properties are, fundamentally different. They're distinct, sui generis, which is just a fancy way of saying unique or in a class of their own. And crucially, they cannot be explained or reduced down to natural properties or concepts. You can't boil goodness down to brain states or social preferences or evolutionary advantages.
So not natural,
Yeah,
but not necessarily supernatural either,
Sure,
just different.
exactly. Key figures here might be Russ Schaefer-Landau or T.M. Scanlon. They typically make two key claims. First, a semantic claim. Moral terms, words like good or right, can't be fully analyzed or defined using only natural terms. Second, a metaphysical claim. Moral properties themselves, the actual goodness or wrongness in the world, cannot be reduced to natural properties. They're just fundamentally different kinds of properties. But importantly, they usually insist that moral facts still supervene on natural facts.
Supervene, what does that mean here?
It means that there can be no moral difference between two situations or two actions without some underlying natural difference. So two actions are identical in all their natural properties, who did what to whom, the consequences, the intentions described in non-moral terms, then they must have the same moral properties. One can't be right and the other wrong if they are naturally identical.
Okay. Like, you can't have two physically identical paintings where one is beautiful and the other isn't. The beauty depends on, or supervenes on, the physical details.
That's a perfect analogy, yes. The moral status depends on the natural facts, even if it isn't reducible to them. And this non-naturalist view often inherits a concern from the philosopher G.E. Moore about the naturalistic fallacy. Moore argued basically that trying to define good in terms of any natural property like pleasure or what's desired is always a mistake. You can always intelligibly ask, yes, but is pleasure really good? Which suggests good means something more, something different.
Okay, but if these moral properties aren't natural and we can't define them naturally, how on earth do we know about them? That seems like a big challenge.
It absolutely is. That's the core epistemological challenge for non-naturalists. How do we gain knowledge of these unique, irreducible moral facts? The common answer they give is that we grasp in the most basic moral truths, things like unnecessary suffering is bad or cruelty is wrong, through a kind of a priori intellectual intuition. Meaning we know them through reason, through understanding the concepts themselves, not through empirical observation or experiment.
Like mathematical truths. 2 + 2 = 4 seems true just by understanding it.
Exactly. They argue these basic moral truths are often self-evident. Just properly understanding them is enough to be justified in believing them.
All right, we've got the two main schools mapped out. Naturalism, seeing morality as part of the natural world, and non-naturalism, seeing it as unique and known through reason. Now, you mentioned earlier these queerness accusations against moral realism. Let's dig into those. What's the first one, the metaphysical queerness?
Right. So this objection really targets non-naturalism more directly. The critics ask, where are these distinct non-natural moral facts? What are they made of? How do they fit into our scientific picture of the universe, which seems full of physical stuff and energy governed by natural laws? Positing these extra irreducible moral properties seems, to critics, like adding something, well, metaphysically strange or queer, almost like introducing ghosts or magic into our ontology. How do they exist alongside quarks and gravity?
Okay, I can see the worry there. It feels a bit spooky. What about the epistemological queerness? You touched on this. How do we know these things?
Exactly. If moral truths aren't detectable by our senses or scientific instruments, how do we access them? Non-naturalists point to that a priori intellectual intuition we talked about. But critics push back, saying, well, what is this faculty of intuition? How does it work? How reliable is it? People seem to have conflicting intuitions all the time. There isn't a clear, agreed-upon account of how this intuition delivers objective, self-evident truths. It seems, again, a bit mysterious or queer compared to sense perception or logical deduction.
Whereas the naturalists have an easier time here.
Arguably, yes. Naturalists like Bloomfield or Foote might use that health analogy again. A skilled doctor develops a kind of intuition for diagnosing illness based on subtle symptoms, but it's an a posteriori intuition built on experience and observation of the natural world, not pure reason. So, less mysterious, perhaps.
Right. And the final one, practical or motivational queerness. This sounds like the so what problem. If some moral fact is true out there, why should I care? Why should it move me to act?
Precisely. This is a really deep and debated issue. It's about the connection between making a moral judgment and actually being motivated to act on it. Many philosophers, including anti-realists like Mark Timmons, but also some realists, argue for a very tight connection. They believe moral judgments are intrinsically motivating, meaning if you genuinely judge that something is morally right for you to do, that judgment itself necessarily gives you at least some motivation to do it. You don't need a separate independent desire.
But hang on, isn't there a whole philosophical tradition, the Humanians, who say belief alone never motivates? That you always need a desire, a passion to get you off the couch?
You've hit the nail on the head. That's exactly the tension. Critics drawing on this Humean picture of motivation, people like Richard Joyce or Michael Smith have argued this forcefully, say that this idea of an intrinsically motivating belief is itself deeply queer. Beliefs are supposed to represent the world. Desires are supposed to motivate us to change it. How can a belief, just a representation of a moral fact, automatically generate motivation without hooking into our existing desires? They ask, what reason could I possibly have to follow some moral rule if doing so doesn't connect at all with anything I already care about, anything in my desiderative set, all my goals, desires, concerns?
It really does sound like asking, okay, it's objectively wrong, but why should I not do it if I don't care?
Exactly. It's like asking, why be moral, or why ought I act as I ought to act? Now, non-naturalists like Scanlon have responses. He argues that being a rational agent just means acting for reasons. And if you genuinely judge that there is a conclusive reason to do something, which is what some moral judgments claim, then that normative belief itself can rationally block the so what question. A truly rational agent, on this view, is motivated by the recognition of reasons, potentially independent of their pre-existing desires.
So reason itself demands compliance.
In a sense, yes. For Scanlon, a belief that identifies a conclusive reason inherently provides motivation for a rational agent. Railton's naturalism also has a take, suggesting that while moral imperatives might be applicable to an agent, meaning they describe what's socially rational, the agent might rationally fail to have a personal reason to obey them if it doesn't connect to their objective interests. So different ways of tackling that motivational gap.
Okay, wow. We've definitely wrestled with some pretty complex philosophical terrain there. But let's bring this back down to earth a bit. Beyond these debates among philosophers, how does any of this actually affect, well, us, you, me, the listener? Does this abstract stuff have any real-world relevance?
That's a fantastic question, and it leads us to think about, well, how do we even figure out what ordinary people think about this? What are folk intuitions about moral realism? Psychologists have actually run quite a few studies trying to measure this, often called folk moral realism. But honestly, many of these studies have run into problems, specifically issues with construct validity.
Construct validity, meaning they weren't really measuring what they thought they were measuring. Why is it so hard to gauge people's basic beliefs about morality being objective or subjective?
Well, several reasons. For one, researchers often didn't clearly distinguish moral realism from other related but distinct ideas. They might have conflated it with cognitivism, just the basic idea that moral sentences can be true or false at all, versus non-cognitivism, like expressivism. Or they conflated it with universalism versus relativism, whether moral truths apply everywhere or depend on the culture. Realism itself doesn't automatically mean universalism, though they often go together in people's minds. Also, sometimes the way questions were phrased or the examples used were problematic. For instance, describing a subjective preference like peanut butter ice cream is delicious as not truth apt, meaning not capable of being true or false, could accidentally nudge people towards thinking all non-factual sounding statements are like that, including moral ones. It's really tricky to explain these philosophical distinctions clearly without biasing the results.
So it's actually quite difficult to get a clear picture of what people really believe about moral facts, or even if they consistently understand the concepts philosophers are debating. Sounds like measuring fog, like you said.
It really does.
Yeah.
It requires very careful methodology, including checks, to make sure participants actually grasp the key concepts being tested. But, and this is the really fascinating part, despite all these difficulties in measurement, some studies have started to uncover something incredibly surprising and impactful. They found evidence of a direct link between believing in moral realism and people's actual moral behavior.
Whoa, okay, now this sounds really interesting. A link between believing morality is objective and what you actually do. Tell me more.
Yes, several studies have used clever priming techniques. They'd subtly get one group of participants thinking about morality as objective, like mathematical truths discoverable, fixed facts. Another group might be primed to think of it as subjective preference, or a control group gets no prime, and they found that priming a belief in moral realism significantly improves subsequent moral behavior.
Improved how? Like, concretely. What did people actually do differently?
Okay, so in one experiment, participants who were briefly primed to think about moral realism were literally twice as likely afterward to make a real charitable donation to an organization helping impoverished children compared to the control group or the group primed with anti-realism.
Twice as likely, just from thinking about morality as objective for a few moments.
Exactly. And in another online study, participants primed with realism statements reported being willing to donate significantly more money to a charity of their own choice compared to those primed with anti-realism.
That is genuinely stunning. So just shifting your mindset slightly, thinking about moral facts as real or non-negotiable, actually changed people's tangible actions, their generosity. That's a huge aha moment.
It really is quite striking. The hypothesis, the thinking behind it, is that considering morality as objective might raise the perceived stakes. If moral duties are real facts, maybe violating them feels more significant. This could motivate better behavior in a couple of ways. Maybe it increases sensitivity to potential judgment, social judgment, or perhaps even divine judgment for some. Or it could boost people's intrinsic motivation, their desire to do the right thing just for its own sake and to see themselves as morally good people. Either way, it shows a clear, measurable impact of these seemingly abstract, meta-ethical beliefs on everyday decisions. It's not just ivory tower stuff. Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. We've covered a lot of ground. What's the big takeaway for someone listening to this deep dive today? Well, I think we've seen that this whole debate around moral realism isn't just, philosophers arguing in circles. It really gets to the heart of what moral truth even is. Are moral claims describing facts about the world, discoverable truths? Or are they just expressions of our attitudes, our feelings, our cultural norms? We've explored the complex differences between the naturalistic view seeing morality as part of the natural world and the non-naturalistic view seeing it as unique, maybe known through reason. And we've looked at those tough queerness challenges. How can these facts exist? How can we know them? And why should they motivate us?
And maybe the most surprising twist for me, and perhaps for you listening, is that final point. Our abstract beliefs about whether morality is objective or not seem to have a very real, measurable effect on our actions, on how charitable we are, for instance.
Absolutely. And that leaves us with a really important question to ponder, doesn't it? If just priming people to think about objective, moral truths can boost pro-social behavior, like charitable giving, what does that imply about how we should talk about morality in our society and our education and our own lives? And perhaps more deeply, what does it suggest about the moral choices we make when we don't feel any external pressure, when it's just us and our conscience? Does a background belief in moral realism make a difference then, too?
Definitely something powerful to chew on as you go about your day. Thanks so much for diving deep with us on this.
Well, that's a wrap. Hope you liked the episode. Don't miss out on new episodes of You Don't Know, You Don't Know. New episodes every week. Like and subscribe.